A single mom opened her door to 68 freezing bikers. What happened the next day changed her life. The gray light outside the windows of Miller's Crossing Diner had already started to fade, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. Sarah Miller ran her rag over the counter one more time, the same spot she had already cleaned twice. The metal was cold under her fingers. Everything in the diner felt cold today, no matter how high she turned the heat. She stopped for a second and looked at the stack of envelopes tucked under the old cash register. She didn't need to open them to know what they said. Past due? Final notice. Please contact us immediately. She had read them so many times the words had stopped meaning anything, like a song played too many times on the radio. The radio. It sat on the shelf behind her, crackling a little the way it always did. The same one her husband Jim had bought at a yard sale years ago. The weatherman's voice came through, serious in a way that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Folks, I want to stress this is not a normal winter storm. The National Weather Service is calling this a historic event. Temperatures will drop below 0 tonight, with wind chills near 20 below. If you don't have to be on the road, do not be on the road. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the window. The sky had turned the color of an old bruise, purple and gray and heavy-looking. The wind had already picked up, rattling the loose gutter on the corner of the building, a gutter she couldn't afford to fix. She glanced over at the booth by the window where her son Danny sat, homework spread out in front of him, though he wasn't really doing it. He was staring at his phone, his thumb barely moving. 14 years old, and he barely spoke anymore, not since his dad died. Some days she caught glimpses of the boy he used to be, quick to laugh, always asking questions. Most days now he was quiet, like a light had been turned down low inside him, and nobody could find the switch to turn it back up. "Danny, honey, you should start heading upstairs before it gets bad out." He didn't look up right away. "Okay," he said, though he didn't move. She sighed, but not in anger. Just tired. Tired in the way that came from doing everything alone for 2 years, cooking, cleaning, paying bills that never seemed to get smaller, raising a boy who needed his father and only had her. She flipped the sign in the window from open to closed, even though it was earlier than usual. Nobody was going to be driving in weather like this, not for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. She'd already lost half her regular customers this year anyway. The diner used to be full every evening. Now some nights she could hear her own footsteps echo across the empty floor. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, empty except for her old truck and Danny's bike leaned against the side of the building. The first snowflakes had started to fall, small and hard, blown sideways by the wind. In the distance, past the tree line, the sky looked almost black already, even though sunset was still an hour off. "Storm's gonna be a bad one," she muttered to herself. Danny had gotten up from the booth without her noticing, and now stood near the door, staring out at the same darkening sky she was looking at. His face didn't show much, but there was something in his eyes, something far away, like he was thinking about a lot more than just the weather. Sarah walked over, put a hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't pull away, which she took as a good sign. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get everything locked up." She turned the key in the door, the bolt sliding into place with a heavy click. Through the glass, the wind was picking up harder now, snow swirling under the buzzing parking lot light. She glanced at Danny one more time, still staring out at the sky like he was waiting for something. Then she looked toward the back room, where the old propane heater sat. I should check that heater before it gets too cold in here, she thought, tucking the thought away for later, unaware of what the night was about to bring to her door. The dishes were the only thing keeping Sarah's hands busy enough to stop them from shaking. She stood at the sink, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. Steam rose up from the hot water and fogged the little window above the faucet. Outside, the wind screamed like something alive, throwing snow against the glass in hard little bursts that sounded like gravel. She had turned the propane heater up as high as it would go, but the kitchen still felt cold in the corners, the kind of cold that crept in through old walls and loose windowsills, no matter how much you fought it. Sarah's back ached. Her feet ached. She had been standing on them since 5 that morning, and now it was nearly 8 at night, and there was nothing left to do but wait out the storm and hope the pipes didn't freeze. Through the pass window, she could see Danny in his usual booth, hunched over his math worksheet with the yellow lamplight falling across the top of his head. He'd finally stopped looking at his phone. Every few minutes his pencil moved, then stopped, then moved again. She loved watching him like this, when he didn't know she was looking. It was in these quiet moments she could still see traces of the boy who used to run through the diner, making airplane noises, weaving between the tables while Jim laughed and told him to slow down before he broke something. She set the pot in the drying rack and dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven door. The wind howled again, rattling the back door hard enough that she glanced over at it, half expecting it to fly open. That was when she saw it. A light out past the kitchen window, swinging low across the parking lot. She froze, towel still in her hands. At first she thought it was just a truck passing on the main road, the kind of thing that happened maybe twice a night out here, even in good weather. But the light didn't pass by. It slowed. Then another light joined it, sweeping in from the same direction, cutting through the snow like a knife through fog. Sarah stepped closer to the window, wiping a circle clear in the condensation with her sleeve. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. There were more lights now. Not 2. Not 4. A whole string of them, one after another, pouring into her empty parking lot like a river finding a new path. Headlights, dozens of them, cutting through the blowing snow, engines growling low and rough, the sound rolling toward the diner like distant thunder. "Danny," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Danny, come here a second." He appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, pencil still in his hand. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. She was too busy staring out the window, watching the lights keep coming, more and more, filling up the lot that had been empty just minutes ago. Danny came up beside her and looked out too. His eyes went wide. "Mom, are those motorcycles?" Sarah's heart thudded hard in her chest. She walked quickly out of the kitchen, through the swinging door, into the front of the diner, Danny close behind her. She pressed her hand against the frosted glass of the front window and rubbed a clear patch with her palm. What she saw outside made her breath stop completely. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Maybe more, rolling in through the storm, one after another, headlights cutting through the thick curtain of snow. Big machines, chrome catching what little light there was, riders wrapped head to toe in heavy leather, snow already piling on their shoulders and helmets. Engine after engine cut off, the growling settling into an eerie quiet broken only by the wind. Sarah's hand trembled against the glass. There had to be 60 of them, maybe more, filling every inch of her small parking lot, engines ticking as they cooled in the freezing air. Then one rider swung his leg off his bike. He was tall, built like a wall, broad shoulders stretching the leather jacket he wore. He said something to the men closest to him, his breath fogging in the cold. And then he started walking, slow and steady, straight toward the diner's front door. Sarah's heart hammered in her ears. She took a step back, pulling Danny gently behind her without even realizing she'd done it. The big man reached the door and stopped. Snow clung to his beard and shoulders, thick and white, like he'd been standing out in it for hours instead of minutes. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there, on the other side of the glass, waiting. Sarah's hand found the deadbolt without her telling it to move there. She didn't turn it. Not yet. The man raised one gloved hand, slow and careful, and knocked. 3 soft taps, not the kind of knock that demanded anything, the kind of knock a person used when they already expected to be told no. "Ma'am?" he called through the glass, his voice deep but muffled by the wind. "I'm sorry to bother you this late. We don't mean any harm." Sarah didn't move. Behind her, she felt Danny's hand grip the back of her shirt. "Mom," he whispered. "There's so many of them." "I know," she whispered back. "Stay behind me." The man outside waited a moment, then spoke again, louder this time so it would carry through the door. "My name's Tank Morrison. Me and my club, we got caught out on the highway when this storm rolled in faster than anybody said it would. Radio's calling it the worst one in 20 years. We got nowhere to go. Nearest town's 40 miles back, and the pass behind us is already closed. Your diner's the only light we've seen in an hour." Sarah's mouth was dry. Through the glass, she could see more of them now, climbing off their bikes, stomping snow from their boots, huddling together in small groups with their arms wrapped tight around themselves. Some of them looked young. One looked like he could have been her father's age, with a gray beard and hunched shoulders. They all looked exhausted. Cold in a way that went past shivering, into something more dangerous. She'd read about that kind of cold, the kind that made people stop shivering because their bodies gave up trying. "How many of you are there?" she called out, surprised her voice worked at all. 68, Tank said. "I know that's a lot to ask. I know what we look like." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, gone quieter, almost gentle. "We won't cause you or your boy any trouble, ma'am. You have my word on that. We just need somewhere warm until this storm breaks. Even just your floor. We'll take anything." Sarah looked past him again, out at the parking lot full of leather and chrome and snow-covered men who looked like they'd stepped out of every nightmare she'd ever had about strangers on the road. Her mind raced through every warning she'd ever been given. Don't open the door for strangers. Don't trust men like that. Lock up, stay safe, protect your son. But then her eyes landed on one of the younger riders, maybe not much older than 20, standing with his arms wrapped around himself, his lips already turning a shade of blue she recognized from nursing Danny through frostbite scares as a toddler. He was shaking so hard she could see it from behind the glass. She thought about Jim, about the kind of man he'd been, the kind who never turned away anybody who needed help, even when it cost him. She thought about the promise she'd made to keep this diner exactly what he'd wanted it to be, a place where nobody who needed something warm ever got turned away. Danny's hand tightened on her shirt again. "Mom, what do we do?" Sarah looked down at him, then back at the door, then out at all those frozen, waiting faces. "We can't leave them out there," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Danny, no matter what happens, they're going to die out there if we don't." She reached out and turned the deadbolt. The click seemed impossibly loud in the quiet diner. The door swung open, and cold air rushed in along with the first 3 riders, snow blowing in behind them in a swirl that made the lamps flicker. Tank stepped through last, ducking his head under the frame, snow melting instantly off his shoulders onto her floor. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers with something like disbelief and gratitude tangled together. Sarah nodded, already moving. "Danny, go grab the extra chairs from the storage closet, all of them. We're going to need everyone we've got." Danny took off toward the back without another word, and more riders began filing through the door, stomping snow, pulling off frozen gloves, filling up her small diner one shivering body at a time. The diner filled up fast. Boots scraped against the old tile floor. Leather jackets creaked as men lowered themselves into booths built for 4, now holding 6. Some sat cross-legged on the floor between tables. Others leaned against the counter, too tired to find a seat at all. Sarah stood behind the counter, watching the room fill wall to wall with strangers, and felt her heart pound so hard she was sure someone could hear it. But there was no time to stand still. She turned toward the kitchen, already rolling up her sleeves. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself. "Okay, Sarah, cook." She threw open the walk-in cooler and started pulling out everything she had. Eggs, bacon, a half case of frozen hash browns, 3 loaves of bread, the big pot of chili she'd made 2 days ago and frozen in case business ever picked back up. She hauled it all to the counter, arms full, and started lighting every burner on the stove. "Danny," she called, "I need every pot we own, and the big skillet, the one Dad used for Sunday mornings." Danny appeared from the storage closet, arms loaded with folding chairs. He set them down and disappeared toward the back again without a word, returning a moment later with pots stacked up to his chin. Sarah worked fast. She cracked eggs into a bowl, 3 dozen at a time. She dropped frozen hash browns onto the griddle in sizzling piles. She stirred the chili with one hand while flipping bacon with the other. Grease popped. Steam rose. The kitchen, usually quiet this late, roared to life around her. She didn't look up much. If she looked up, she'd see all those faces out there, all that leather and all those tattoos, and she'd remember how impossible this whole night was. It was easier to look down at the eggs, to focus on the bacon, to keep her hands busy so her mind didn't have room to panic. But every few minutes, she couldn't help herself. She'd glance through the pass window into the dining room, and each time, what she saw surprised her a little more. The bikers weren't loud. They weren't rowdy, the way she'd braced herself for. They spoke in low voices, careful ones, like men who understood they were guests in someone else's house. A few of them helped stack extra chairs along the wall to make more room. One older rider, gray-bearded and heavyset, noticed a younger man shivering near the door and silently traded seats with him, moving him closer to the heater vent without being asked. And in the middle of it all was Tank. He moved through the crowded room slow and steady, the way a man moves when he's used to being watched and doesn't need to hurry to be heard. He didn't shout orders. He didn't need to. He'd just lean down and say something quiet to a cluster of men, and they'd nod and shift to make room or lower their voices or help someone who needed it. "Boots off if you're going to put your feet up," Sarah heard him say to one man, stretching out along a booth bench. "This is her home, not a garage floor." The man mumbled an apology and pulled his boots off, setting them neatly beneath the table. Sarah watched that exchange through the pass window, spatula still in her hand, and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Not all the way. She was still standing in a diner full of 68 strangers in the middle of the worst storm in 20 years. But watching Tank move through that room, calm and steady, watching him keep his men respectful without ever raising his voice, she let herself breathe out. Just a little. She looked over at Danny. He was standing near the edge of the kitchen doorway, half hidden by the frame, watching the dining room with wide eyes. Not scared eyes, though. Curious ones. He watched the way the big man near the window fixed the loose folding chair with nothing but a pocket knife and a piece of wire. He watched the way two younger riders argued good-naturedly over a shared plate of bacon like brothers would. Sarah turned back to her stove, sliding the last of the hash browns onto a plate, and reached for the final can of beans in her pantry. There was nothing left after this. She'd used it all. Sarah loaded up the last tray with plates and pushed through the swinging door into the dining room. Steam rose off scrambled eggs. Bacon sat stacked in the little piles, crispy at the edges, just how her husband used to make it. She'd stretched 3 dozen eggs into something that looked like a feast, and pancakes, too, made from the last of the flour and a little sugar and cinnamon she found tucked in the back of the pantry. "Here you go," she said, setting a plate down in front of the gray-bearded man who'd given up his seat by the heater earlier. "Careful, it's hot." "Ma'am, you didn't have to do all this," he said, looking down at the plate like it was something precious. "Well, I did," Sarah said, "so eat it before it gets cold." He smiled at that, a real smile, and dug in. She moved table to table, plate after plate, until her arms ached and her feet felt like lead. But something strange happened as she worked. The fear that had gripped her chest all night began to loosen, plate by plate, thank you by thank you. "This is the best meal I've had in years," one younger rider said, mouth still full of pancake. "You didn't have to feed 68 strangers?" said another, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe it. "Most people wouldn't have even opened the door." "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted, setting down his plate. "But I figured, freezing to death seemed worse than a little risk." The man laughed, a big, warm sound. "Smart woman." As she moved through the room, she started to catch pieces of conversation. Stories, some of them. A biker 2 booths over was telling his neighbor about a ride he took through the Rockies, how the snow up there looked just like tonight, but twice as deadly. Another was talking about his granddaughter's birthday party, how he'd missed it because of a mechanical breakdown down south, and how bad he felt about it. They weren't strangers anymore. Not really. They were just people. Tired, hungry, grateful people who happened to ride motorcycles and wear leather. By the time she got to the last table, her tray was empty and her arms were shaking from the effort. She leaned against the counter for a moment, catching her breath, and looked out over the room. It was quiet now, mostly. Bellies full, the men had started to settle. Some leaned back in booths with their eyes closed. Others had found spots on the floor, using rolled-up jackets as pillows. The storm still howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the diner, it felt warm. Safe, even. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and let her eyes drift toward Danny. He was sitting near the far corner of the room, cross-legged on the floor next to an older biker, one Sarah hadn't served yet. The man had weathered skin and silver hair pulled back in a short ponytail, and he was holding something small in his rough hands, turning it over so the light caught it. Sarah stepped closer, curious, careful not to interrupt. "See this little groove here?" the old biker was saying, pointing at the tool with a thick, calloused finger. "That's for adjusting the carburetor. My daddy gave me this back in '68. Older than your mama, probably." Danny leaned in, eyes fixed on the tool like it held some kind of secret. "What's a carburetor do?" The old man chuckled, low and warm. "Mixes the fuel and the air so the engine can breathe right. You want it too rich, you flood it. Too lean, it starves. Gotta find the balance?" Danny nodded slowly, like he was memorizing every word. "You want to hold it?" the old man asked, offering the tool. Danny's hand came up slow, careful, like he was being given something made of glass. He turned it over in his palm the way the old man had, studying the worn metal. And then it happened. The corner of his mouth lifted. Just a little. Just enough. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, dish towel still in her hand, staring at her son. It wasn't a full smile. It wasn't laughter. but it was more than she'd seen on his face in months, more than she'd seen since the funeral, since the silence had settled over him like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. Her throat tightened. She pressed the towel to her mouth and blinked hard, not wanting to cry in front of 68 strangers, not wanting to make a scene. But her heart, for the first time in a long time, felt something close to hope. Sarah's eyes opened slow, blinking against the gray light pushing through the diner's front windows. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her neck ached from the angle she'd slept in, curled up on the old couch in the back office, and her legs were tangled in a blanket someone must have draped over her sometime in the night. She didn't remember lying down. She must have collapsed sometime after 4 in the morning, when her body finally gave out. She sat up slow, rubbing her eyes. Silence. That was the first thing she noticed. Real silence, the kind that presses against your ears. No wind rattling the windows. No low murmur of 68 men shifting in booths and on the floor. No snoring. No quiet talking. None of the sounds that had filled her diner all night long. Her heart gave a small, worried jump. She pushed the blanket off her legs and stood, wincing at the stiffness in her back, and walked toward the swinging door that led to the dining room. She pushed it open, careful, like she was afraid of what she might find. The room was empty. Every booth was clear. Every table wiped clean. The chairs were tucked in neat, all except a few pushed slightly out like someone had risen in a hurry. The floor, which had been covered in bedrolls and jackets and boots just hours before, was swept clean, not a speck of mud or melted snow anywhere near the door. Sarah stood there, blinking, her hand still on the swinging door. "Hello?" she called out, voice cracking from sleep. Nothing answered back. She walked further into the room, her socked feet quiet against the tile floor, and looked towards the windows. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. It sat piled high against the parking lot, soft and blue in the early morning light, the storm's fury completely gone. The world looked washed clean, still and calm, like the blizzard had never happened at all. But the motorcycles were gone too. Every last one. The parking lot, which had been packed edge to edge with headlights and chrome just hours before, now sat empty except for the snow, smooth and undisturbed except for a single set of tire tracks leading out toward the road. Sarah felt her chest tighten, a strange mix of relief and something like loss. They were gone, all of them. Even Tank. She walked slow through the dining room, running her hand along the edge of a booth, still half expecting someone to pop up from behind the counter and surprise her. But the diner felt different somehow. Not just empty, cared for, like someone had spent hours making sure everything was exactly right before they left. She noticed the counter had been wiped down until it shined. The coffee pots were clean and empty, rinsed and set upside down to dry. Even the old jukebox in the corner, the one that hadn't worked right in years, had its cracked glass front wiped clean of dust. Something caught the corner of her eye through the window. A flicker of light, red and pink, glowing faint against the snow outside. Sarah froze. Her broken sign, the one that had been dark and busted for months, ever since a windstorm knocked half the letters loose last spring. She hadn't had the money to fix it, so it just sat there, half lit, buzzing weak whenever it worked at all. She moved toward the front door fast, her heart pounding now, and pushed it open. The cold air hit her face, sharp and clean, but she barely noticed. There it was. Miller's Crossing Diner, glowing bright and whole against the pale morning sky, every letter lit up like it was brand new. No flickering, no dead bulbs. just steady, warm light shining out over the snow. Sarah's mouth fell open. She stepped further out onto the porch, her breath catching in little clouds in front of her face, and looked up at the roof. The spot that had been leaking for weeks, the one she'd been catching with a bucket every time it rained, was covered now with a fresh blue tarp, stretched tight and secured with new nails along every edge. It looked solid, careful, like someone had climbed up there in the freezing dark and made sure her family would stay dry. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes, and turned back toward the door, walking fast now, almost running. She pushed inside, and her eyes went straight to the counter. There, sitting square in the middle, was a thick envelope, folded over once. Written across the front in plain, blocky handwriting were 4 simple words. For the food. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. It was heavy, thick with folded bills. She didn't need to count it to know it was more than enough to cover the food she'd cooked, more than she would have ever asked for. "They didn't have to do this," she whispered to the empty room. That's when she heard it. A small sound, like someone shifting in a booth seat coming from the back corner of the diner. Sarah spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. There, sitting quiet in the last booth by the window, was Tank. His big frame took up most of the seat, his leather jacket still on, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that must have gone cold hours ago. He hadn't left with the others. He'd been there the whole time, watching her discover everything, saying nothing. "You're still here," Sarah said, the words coming out soft, almost like a question. Tank nodded slow. His eyes, tired but steady, met hers across the room. "Figured somebody should stick around. Make sure you didn't wake up scared, thinking you dreamed the whole thing." Sarah walked toward him, still holding the envelope, her legs feeling strange beneath her, like she wasn't quite sure they belonged to her. She stopped near the edge of the booth. "The sign, the roof, this." She held up the envelope. "You didn't have to do any of this, Tank. You already said you'd cause no trouble. That would have been enough." "Wasn't about trouble," Tank said. "Was about doing right by you. You opened your door to 68 strangers in the middle of the worst storm this town's seen in years. Didn't have to do that either, but you did." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She sat down slow across from him, setting the envelope on the table between them like it was something fragile. "I couldn't leave you all out there to freeze. Wasn't really a choice." "Sure it was," Tank said, his voice quiet but firm. "Could have kept that door locked. Could have called the cops, told them a bunch of bikers were trying to break in. A lot of folks would have done exactly that." He shook his head slow. "You didn't. That means something." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat there, her hands folded on the table, watching the steam from Tank's cold coffee no longer rising. "Can we talk?" Tank asked, his eyes searching hers. "Before I head out. There's something I need to tell you." Something in his voice made Sarah's stomach tighten, a small warning bell she couldn't quite explain. "Okay," she said slow. Tank set his mug down and leaned forward slightly, his big hands folding together on the table. "This place. This land you're sitting on. It didn't come to me by accident that I ended up here last night." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Tank's eyes drifted toward the window for a moment, looking out at the snow-covered lot like he was seeing something else entirely, something from long ago. "My mother used to own this land, years back. Before you, before your husband, before any of this was ever a diner." Sarah blinked, sure she'd misheard him. "Your mother?" "Decades ago," Tank said, his voice rough now, thick with something Sarah hadn't heard from him before. She had a little house here, a garden out back. Lost it during hard times, way before I was old enough to understand what that meant. She talked about this place right up until she passed, said it was the only home that ever felt like hers. Sarah sat frozen, trying to make sense of what he was telling her. You're saying you knew this was here? That you found us on purpose? Tank nodded slow. Been looking for this piece of land for years. Never thought I'd actually find it. Not with a blizzard, not with 68 guys stuck on the road needing shelter. He shook his head, like even he couldn't quite believe it. But here I am, and here you are. Before Sarah could find any words to respond, a low rumble sounded outside, growing louder, tires crunching slow through the snow-covered lot. Sarah turned toward the window and saw a white truck pulling up close to the diner, the words "Certified Mail" printed in bold letters across its side. Her stomach dropped. "Ma'am, certified letter. Need a signature." Sarah's legs felt heavy as she walked to the door. The driver, bundled in a thick coat, held out a small electronic pad and a thick envelope with red stamped letters across the front. She signed her name without really seeing it, her fingers numb from more than just the cold. She shut the door and stood there for a moment, staring at the envelope like it might bite her. "Sarah?" Tank had gotten up from the booth. He stood near the counter now, watching her with careful eyes. The diner's front door chimed again, and Danny came shuffling out from the back hallway, his hair messy from sleep, one of the extra blankets still wrapped around his shoulders. He must have woken up to the sound of the truck. His eyes moved from his mother's pale face to the envelope in her hands. "Mom? What is it?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She walked to the counter, set the envelope down, and stared at it for a long moment before she finally tore it open. Her hands were shaking so bad the paper crinkled loud in the quiet diner. She unfolded the letter and began to read. Her eyes moved fast at first, then slower, like the words were getting harder to understand the further she went. "Sarah?" Tank said again, softer this time. "It's..." Sarah's voice cracked. She had to stop and try again. "It's from a lawyer, representing someone named Wendell Cross." Danny stepped closer, his blanket forgotten, sliding off one shoulder. "Who's that?" Sarah kept reading, her eyes scanning the page like she was hoping the words would change if she looked hard enough. He says Mike borrowed money from him, a lot of money, years ago, before he..." She couldn't finish that sentence. She never could. Tank's jaw tightened. "How much?" Sarah's hand pressed flat against her mouth for a second before she could speak. $43,000. The number came out barely above a whisper. "With interest, it says. Due in full. 5 days." She looked up, and her eyes were wet, shining under the diner's flickering overhead light. 5 days, Tank. Or I lose the diner. He says the loan was secured against the property. This property." The paper trembled in her hands. Danny's face had gone pale, his young eyes wide with a fear that made him look even younger than 14. "Lose the diner? Mom, this is our home. This is everything." Sarah couldn't answer him. She felt her knees buckle slightly, and she reached out for the edge of the counter to steady herself. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in close. 2 years of scraping by, of counting pennies, of pretending everything was fine for Danny's sake, and now this. A debt she never knew about. A secret her husband had carried and never told her. Maybe never even had the chance to tell her before the accident took him. She stumbled to the nearest booth and sank down into it, the letter still clutched in her hand, her shoulders curling forward like she was trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the cracked vinyl seat. "I don't understand," she said, mostly to herself. How could he not tell me? How could he keep something like this from me? Danny hovered near the booth, his hands twisting the edge of his blanket, his young face tight with a fear he didn't know how to hide. He looked so much like he had the day they'd gotten the news about his father. Lost. Small. Scared of a world that kept taking things away. Tank watched the boy's face for a long moment. Something in his expression hardened, quiet and sure, like a decision settling into place. He walked over slow and crouched down beside the booth, bringing himself level with Sarah's downturned eyes. Sarah, he said, his voice steady, low, the same voice he'd used the night before to calm 68 tired men. Look at me. She lifted her eyes to his, and he held her gaze without blinking. I'm not going anywhere, Tank said. Not until this gets sorted out. You hear me? Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Tank was already reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb moved across the screen, finding a name in his contacts. He held the phone to his ear and waited, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The next morning came gray and quiet, the kind of cold that made the windows sweat on the inside. Sarah had barely slept. She'd spent most of the night sitting at her kitchen table, going through old boxes of Mike's papers, looking for any sign of the loan, any hint that he'd known what he was doing to her. She found nothing. Just old receipts. A birthday card Danny had made him in second grade, a photo of the two of them standing in front of the diner the day they signed the lease. She'd cried over that one for a long time. At 8:30, the bell above the diner door jingled, and Tank walked in with two men she hadn't seen before. One was tall and thin, with silver hair combed neat and small reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He carried a leather satchel that looked older than he was, worn soft at the corners. The other man was shorter, built solid like a fire plug, with thick forearms and grease stains that seemed permanent under his fingernails. He had a rolled-up set of blueprints tucked under one arm, and a toolbox in his other hand, like he'd come ready to fix something even before he knew what needed fixing. Sarah, Tank said, this is Walt. He nodded to the thin man with the glasses. Used to work as a paralegal for 22 years before he retired, and this is Gus. He nodded to the shorter man. Ran his own contracting business for 30 years, knows how to read a paper trail as good as he knows how to read a blueprint. Walt gave a small nod, polite and quiet. Ma'am? Gus set his toolbox down by the counter with a heavy thunk. Heard you got some trouble with paperwork. Figured we'd take a look. Sarah looked between the three men, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Part of her wanted to say she could handle this herself, that she didn't need more people getting tangled up in her problems. But another part of her, the tired part, the part that had been carrying this weight alone for 2 years, was grateful beyond words that she didn't have to sit with the letter by herself anymore. I don't even know where to start, she admitted, her voice small. That's all right, Walt said gently. We do. Danny came out from the back, still in his school clothes, backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused when he saw the men, his eyes flicking to Tank like he was looking for reassurance. You're not going to school today, Sarah said before he could ask. I already called, told them you weren't feeling good. Danny didn't argue. He set his backpack down by the door and came to stand near the booth, watching as Walt and Gus began spreading papers across the table. Sarah had gathered every document she could find. The loan letter, old bank statements, copies of the deed to the diner, even a folder of Mike's business papers from before he died. Walt pulled his glasses down from his forehead and began sorting through the papers with careful, practiced hands. He laid them out in neat rows, muttering dates under his breath as he worked. Gus unrolled his blueprints on the counter, comparing them against the property lines listed in the loan documents, checking measurements against the old survey maps he'd brought along. The hours passed slow and quiet. The diner smelled like coffee that Sarah kept brewing out of nervous habit, refilling cups nobody was really drinking. Danny sat in the booth across from the men, watching everything with a stillness that made him seem older than 14. By early afternoon, sunlight had shifted through the windows, casting long stripes across the table full of paper. Walt had been quiet for almost 20 minutes, flipping back and forth between two documents, holding them up to the light one after another. "Huh," he said finally. Everyone looked at him. "What is it?" Tank asked, leaning over the table. Walt held up 2 pages side by side. "This signature here." He pointed to the bottom of the loan agreement. "And this one here, from the deed transfer 3 years back." His finger tapped each one in turn. "Look at the way the letters slant. The M in Miller. They're not the same. Not even close." Gus leaned in over his shoulder, squinting at the pages. "And look at this date," he said, pointing to a line near the top. "Says the loan was signed in March, but this bank statement right here," he pulled another paper from the pile, "shows the account this money supposedly came from wasn't even opened until June." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The next 2 days moved fast, faster than Sarah had felt time move in a long while. Every morning, before the sun was even all the way up, she'd hear the low rumble of motorcycles pulling into the lot. Different men each time, rotating in shifts like they had somewhere else to be but chose to be here instead. Roy showed up both mornings, sleeves rolled up, ready to work on whatever needed fixing. He replaced a cracked window pane in the back room without being asked. He tightened the wobbly leg on the booth by the window that had been broken since before Mike died. Danny worked beside him most of the afternoon, holding tools, learning the names of things he'd never thought to ask about before. Sarah kept the diner open both days, moving through her routine of eggs and coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches, grateful for something normal to do with her hands while her mind stayed tangled up in loan papers and forged signatures. The bikers ate what she made and always left more money on the table than the bill called for, no matter how many times she told them not to. Walt came back every morning too, setting up at the same booth, spreading out new papers each day. He didn't say much, just worked steady and quiet, the same way Gus worked steady and quiet on his side of things, checking measurements and comparing old surveys against new ones. By the second evening, Walt had found something. He'd gone to the county records office both days, using an old friend who still worked there to pull public filings. What he found made him go quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that comes before bad news. Wendell Cross had done this before. Not once, 3 times. There was a bakery 2 towns over, run by a widow named Doris Kellerman, who'd lost her building 4 years back to a loan almost identical to Sarah's. Forged signature, inflated interest, a payment schedule that made no sense next to the actual paperwork trail. There was a hardware store owner named Frank Alvarez, whose business folded under similar circumstances 2 years before that. And there was a small auto shop, closed now, that used to belong to a man named Curtis Boyd, who according to the county records had simply disappeared from town not long after losing his shop. 3 names, 3 ruined lives, all following the same pattern Cross had used on Sarah. That evening, after the last customer left and Sarah flipped the sign on the door to closed, Tank stayed behind while the rest of the men headed out for the night. He sat across from her in the corner booth, the one Danny liked best, with a folder of copied papers spread out between them. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and careful, "I need to show you something." He walked her through it slow, the way Walt had walked him through it earlier. The forged signatures, the mismatched dates, The pattern of predatory loans stretching back years, each one aimed at someone who couldn't afford a lawyer, someone grieving or struggling or just plain trusting. He's done this to at least 3 other people, Tank said. Probably more we haven't found yet. Sarah stared at the papers, her hands pressed flat against the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. 3 other people, she repeated softly, and nobody stopped him. Nobody had the resources to fight back, Tank said. Most people don't. That's what he counts on. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy in the dim light of the diner. What happens now? Now, Tank said, we get you a real lawyer, somebody who can take all this and build a case. My club's got connections. One of my guys, his sister's a lawyer, does this kind of work. She's tough. She'll want to take this on, especially once she sees what he's done to other folks in town. Sarah's throat tightened. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent alone with this fear, the sleepless nights, the quiet terror of losing everything Mike had built for them. She thought about Danny, carrying worry no 14-year-old should have to carry. And now here was this man, sitting across from her in a booth that used to wobble, promising her she wasn't alone anymore. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She wiped at them quickly, embarrassed, but Tank just sat there quiet, letting her have the moment. I haven't felt this hopeful, she said, her voice breaking, in a really long time. The next afternoon came in bright and cold, the kind of sharp winter sun that made everything look clean, like the world had been washed overnight. Sarah stood at the kitchen window with a rag in her hand, meaning to wipe down the counter, but she hadn't moved in almost 5 minutes. Out in the parking lot, Danny was bent over the engine of an old motorcycle, a faded blue one that belonged to Roy. Roy stood next to him, sleeves pushed up past his elbows despite the cold, pointing at something inside the engine and talking with his hands the way people do when they love what they're explaining. See this part right here? Roy said, loud enough that Sarah could hear it through the window glass. That's your carburetor. Fancy word, but really it just mixes the gas and the air so the engine can breathe. Bike won't run right if this thing's dirty. Danny leaned in close, squinting like he was trying to memorize every piece. So it's stalling because it can't breathe? Now you're getting it. Roy grinned and handed him a rag. Go on. Wipe it down easy. Don't force nothing. Sarah watched her son take the rag like it was something precious. He worked slow and careful, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in concentration, the same way it used to when he was little and coloring inside the lines. She hadn't seen that look on his face in 2 years. She'd almost forgotten it existed. Roy said something else, something she couldn't quite hear, and Danny laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It wasn't loud or long, but it was real, the kind that comes up out of a person before they can stop it, and it hit Sarah square in the chest like a fist. She had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. She hadn't heard her son laugh like that since before Mike died. 2 years of careful silence, of one-word answers and closed doors, of a boy who carried grief like a stone in his pocket, heavy and always there. And here he was, standing in a parking lot with a man he'd known for 2 days, laughing like a kid was supposed to laugh. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and turned away from the window before either of them could see her cry over something so simple as a laugh. That night, after the diner was closed and swept and the lights were dimmed low, Sarah climbed the stairs to tuck Danny in, a habit she'd kept even now that he was 14 and probably too old for it. He never complained. She thought maybe he needed it as much as she did. His room was small, the walls still decorated with a poster of a car he used to love when he was 10, edges curling with age. Danny was already under the covers, eyes heavy, worn out from a full day of engine grease and cold air, and Roy's patient teaching. "Good night, baby," Sarah said, smoothing his hair back the way she used to when he was small. "Night, Mom," he mumbled, already halfway to sleep. She stood and clicked off the lamp on his nightstand, and that's when she saw it. His old laptop, the one Mike had bought him 3 Christmases ago, sat open on the desk across the room, the screen dimmed but not fully off, a faint glow still coming from it. Sarah crossed the room quietly, meaning to shut it, the way she always did when she found electronics left on. "Waste of a charge," Mike used to say. "Old habits." Her fingers hovered just above the lid. Danny stirred behind her, turning over in his sleep, the covers rustling. He murmured something soft and unclear, then went still again, his breathing settling back into the slow rhythm of deep sleep. Sarah paused, her hand still hovering there in the dark. Something made her stop. Maybe it was the hour, or the tiredness pulling at her own bones, or just some quiet instinct that told her to leave the boy be, to not disturb whatever small privacy he had left in a world that had already taken so much from him. She drew her hand back without touching the screen. Sarah looked at her son one more time, sleeping peacefully, his face soft and unguarded the way it only was in sleep these days. Then she turned and walked out of the room, pulling the door quietly closed behind her, leaving the laptop open on the desk, its light still glowing faintly in the dark. 2 mornings later, the diner was quiet in that particular way it got after the breakfast rush, when the dishes were done and the coffee pot sat half empty on the warmer. Sarah wiped down the last table and glanced at the clock. Danny was at school. Tank wasn't due until 2. She had a few hours to herself, which felt like a strange kind of luxury these days. She needed to print the new supplier form for the flour delivery, the one the distributor had emailed her twice already, and her own laptop was upstairs somewhere with a battery that hadn't held a charge since last winter. Danny's was still on his desk, plugged in, the screen dark now but ready. "Just this once," she muttered to herself, climbing the stairs. She sat down at his desk, feeling a little like an intruder in her own son's room, and opened the laptop. The screen woke up slow, showing his usual desktop, a picture of him and Mike at a lake somewhere, fishing poles in hand, both of them squinting into the sun. Sarah's chest tightened, looking at it, but she pushed through, opening his email to find the attachment from the distributor. Her hand slipped on the mouse pad. A folder blinked open on the screen, one she didn't recognize, tucked away in a corner of his file system labeled simply MISC. She hadn't meant to click it. Her finger had just brushed the wrong spot. Inside were screenshots, dozens of them. Sarah frowned, leaning closer, her curiosity getting the better of her good sense about privacy. The images showed a forum page, black background, an eagle wing logo in the corner. Across the top, in bold letters, Hell's Angels Regional Charity Network. Community requests. Her stomach did something strange, a slow drop, like the first dip on a roller coaster. She clicked on the first screenshot, and there it was. A post dated back in October, months before the blizzard, months before any of this had started. The username was something random, a string of letters and numbers that told her nothing, but the words underneath were unmistakably her son's. "My mom runs a diner. She thinks I don't see how hard things are. Last night I came downstairs for water, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills, crying so quiet I almost didn't hear it. She never cries in front of me. She's been doing everything by herself since my dad died, and I don't know how to help her. I saw on here that you guys help people sometimes. I don't know if this is even a real thing or if anyone will read this. I just don't know what else to do." Sarah's hand came up to her mouth. She scrolled further, her breath catching in her throat with each screenshot. There were replies, some from other users, kind words, a few practical suggestions about local resources. And then, near the bottom, a response from an account with a small icon that looked like a wrench crossed with a wing. The reply was short. "We got people in a lot of places. Send us the town." And Danny had answered. Just the name of the town, and the cross streets near the diner. Nothing more. No address, no name, nothing that could have traced back to him directly. Just enough. Sarah sat back in the chair, her hands trembling now, the laptop's glow the only light in the dim room since she hadn't bothered turning on the overhead. She thought of Danny at 10 years old, at the lake with his father, easy and light. She thought of him at 14, silent at the dinner table, carrying something so heavy she'd had no idea it was there. He'd seen her crying. He'd never said a word. He'd carried that image of his mother broken at the kitchen table for months, alone. And instead of telling her, instead of asking for help the way a kid should be able to, he'd gone looking for strangers on the internet who might save them both. Sarah closed the laptop slowly, her fingers numb, and carried it down the stairs without really deciding to. She set it on the kitchen table, still open a crack, the screen glow fading to black as she pulled out a chair and sat down across from it. She didn't move. She couldn't. The rag she'd been using to wipe tables was still balled up in her other hand, forgotten. She was still sitting there, frozen, staring at nothing, when she heard the low rumble of Tank's truck pulling into the lot outside, right on time for their 2:00 meeting. The truck door slammed outside, and boots crunched across the gravel. Sarah didn't move. She stayed frozen at the table, the laptop still glowing faintly in front of her, until the bell over the diner door jingled and Tank stepped inside, stomping the cold off his boots. "Hey," he said, pulling off his gloves. "You ready for that supply list, or you want me to start on the back door hinge first?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She just turned the laptop around and slid it across the table toward him. Tank frowned, coming closer. He looked at the screen, at the forum page with the Eagle Wing logo, and something in his face shifted. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slow, like his knees had suddenly gotten old. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice quiet. "It's Danny's," Sarah said. "I was looking for a supplier form on his laptop. I wasn't trying to snoop, I just found it." Tank read the post. Sarah watched his eyes move across the screen, watched his jaw tighten, watched something soften around his mouth at the same time, like two feelings were fighting for the same space on his face. "Tank," Sarah said, "is this it? Is this why you all ended up here? Not the storm, not chance. This." Tank set the laptop down gently, like it was something fragile, something that might break if he wasn't careful. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. The quiet stretched out between them, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the wind pushing against the windows. "We got a guy," he finally said. "Runs a small charity network for the club. Guys post about towns that need help, food drives, coats for kids, that kind of thing. He flags requests, checks them out, matches them up with chapters passing through. It's not much, just something we do." "And Danny's post?" Tank nodded slow. "Came through months back. Didn't have a name, didn't have an address, just a town and some cross streets." He paused. "Thing is, I'd been keeping half an eye on that same area for years. My mother's land records back before it all got sold off. I never told anyone that. Just kept it filed away in my head, hoping one day I'd get out this way and take a look." Sarah felt her chest tighten. When the request came in matching that same area, Tank went on. My liaison mentioned it to me, just in passing. Didn't think nothing of it at the time. But it stuck with me. When the weather turned bad and we needed a route change, I steered us this way without even really deciding to. I told myself it was just a shortcut. He looked up at her. But it wasn't a shortcut, Sarah. It was this. It was always going to be this. Sarah's eyes filled before she even realized it was happening. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, but it didn't stop the tears that spilled over, hot and sudden. He never said anything, she whispered. He watched me cry at that table and he never said a word. He just went and did this instead, all by himself. He carried that around for months, Tank, alone. 14 years old, and he carried that alone. Sarah. Tank's voice was low, steady. I keep thinking about him, she said, her voice breaking now, the words tumbling out faster than she could stop them. Sitting up there in his room, typing that out, not knowing if anyone would even read it, not knowing if it would help or if it was just words disappearing into nothing. And he did it anyway. For me. Because he didn't know what else to do. She put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, the weight of it finally breaking loose after 2 days of holding steady. Tank reached across the table, his big hand covering hers, warm and rough and certain. It wasn't fate that brought us here, he said quietly. Wasn't luck, wasn't the storm. It was that boy's love for his mother. That's what did it. That's what pulled 68 bikes down this road in a blizzard, whether any of us knew it at the time or not. Sarah looked up at him, tears streaking down her face, and Tank held her gaze, steady as ever. Your son saved you, he said, long before we ever showed up. Sarah waited until Saturday morning, when the diner was closed, and the only sound in the kitchen was the soft tick of the old wall clock. Danny sat across from her at the small table where they took their meals, a bowl of cereal going soft in front of him, untouched. She had asked him to sit down. Nothing more than that. But something in her voice must have told him this wasn't about chores or homework, because his shoulders had gone stiff the moment he sat. She slid the laptop across to him, screen dark now, closed like a door. I found your post, she said gently. The one on the forum. About me. Danny's face went pale, then red. He looked down at the table, at his hands, at anything that wasn't his mother's eyes. I wasn't trying to make it weird, he mumbled. I didn't think anyone would even see it. Danny, I just... His voice cracked, and he stopped, swallowing hard. I saw you crying over the bills that one night. You didn't know I saw. You had your head down on the counter and you thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't fix it. I'm 14. I can't get a job. I can't pay anything. I couldn't even mow a lawn around here in December. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. So I just typed something out. I found that page because one of the guys at school said his uncle rides with a club that does stuff like that. Food drives and coats and stuff. I didn't think it would do anything. I just needed to do something. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, the way she used to when he was small enough to still let her. You carried that by yourself, she said, her voice trembling. For months. You never told me. I didn't want you to feel bad, Danny said. I didn't want you to think I was scared, even though I was. I just wanted to help. That's all I wanted. Oh, baby. Sarah stood and came around the table, and Danny let her pull him up into a hug, tall as he was getting, still just a boy underneath it all. She held him the way she hadn't in a long time, both of them crying now, the kind of crying that comes from someplace old and tired and finally let loose. You didn't have to carry this alone, she said into his hair. That's my job. I'm the mom. I'm supposed to carry the hard stuff so you don't have to." "I know," Danny said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "But you were carrying so much already. I just wanted to carry something too." Sarah pulled back and held his face in her hands, looking at him, really looking, the way she hadn't in what felt like forever. His father's eyes looked back at her, and for the first time since the funeral, that didn't feel like only grief. It felt like something else too. Pride, maybe. Or hope. "You are the bravest kid I know," she told him. "You hear me? What you did, reaching out like that, not knowing if anyone would ever answer, that took more guts than most grown men have." Danny gave a small, wet laugh. "Tank said something like that too." "Tank's a smart man." They sat back down together, and for a long while they just talked, really talked, about the bills, about missing Dad, about how scared they'd both been without ever saying it out loud to each other. It was the kind of conversation that should have happened months ago, and now that it finally had, something in the kitchen felt lighter, like a window cracked open after being shut too long. That evening, headlights swept across the gravel lot, and Tank's boots came up the porch steps 2 at a time, faster than his usual steady gait. He pushed through the door with something like excitement written across his weathered face. "Linda's in," he said, not even bothering to take off his jacket. Roy's sister. She reviewed everything, the loan papers, the forged signatures, all of it. "She's agreeing to represent you, Sarah. You and the others' cross swindled." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. "Court date's set, 2 weeks out." The paper sat on the counter for a long moment before Sarah picked it up, her fingers running over the words like she needed to feel them to believe them. 2 weeks. It felt so close and so far away at the same time. "There's more," Tank said, finally shrugging off his jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door like he lived there now. In a way, he sort of did. "Linda's already tracking down the other names. Cross didn't just come after you, Sarah. There's a hardware store owner over in Millbrook, a lady who runs a flower shop on 3rd Street, an old guy with an auto repair place out past the highway. All of them got squeezed the same way. Forged papers, inflated numbers, threats when they asked questions." "How many?" Sarah asked. "So far, 4 besides you. Linda thinks there might be more once word gets around that people are finally standing up to him." Danny, who had been pretending not to listen while doing homework at the counter, looked up. "Are they going to testify? Like, actually go to court and say what happened?" "Some of them are scared," Tank admitted. "Cross has bullied people a long time, but scared people get braver when they see they're not alone." Over the next several days, that proved true. Roy and 2 other club members, a quiet man named Gus, who used to work in insurance before he traded suits for leather, and a woman named Pepper, who had a memory like a steel trap, drove out to visit each of the victims personally. They didn't come as strangers with lawyers behind them. They came as people who had sat in Sarah's diner and heard her story. People who understood what it felt like to be smaller than the man trying to crush you. One by one, the victims began to open up. The flower shop owner, a soft-spoken widow named Mrs. Alvarez, cried when she finally showed Linda the paperwork she'd been too ashamed to show anyone else. The hardware store owner brought out a whole box of letters Cross had sent him, threats disguised as polite legal language, each piece added to a case that was growing stronger by the day. Meanwhile, the diner had come back to life in a way Sarah hadn't seen since her husband was alive. Word had spread through town, the way stories do in small places, passed from one kitchen table to another, until half the county seemed to know about the diner on the blizzard night, and the bikers who fixed the roof, and the widow who fed 68 strangers out of her own pantry. Curious locals started showing up just to see the place for themselves, and once they tasted Sarah's cooking, they kept coming back. Booths that had sat empty for months were full again. The old bell over the door rang almost constantly. Bikers rotated through, some working on the building, some just eating breakfast and chatting with regulars who had once crossed the street to avoid men in leather vests. Slowly, carefully, the walls between two different worlds started coming down. By the following Friday, the energy in the diner had turned into something like a celebration. Somebody brought a folding table from home. Somebody else brought a cooler of soda. Sarah found herself cooking more food than she had in weeks. Laughing as she flipped pancakes and refilled coffee cups, the diner packed wall to wall with bikers, neighbors, and curious kids from down the street. Danny stood near the back parking lot with Roy and a small cluster of neighborhood boys gathered around an old motorcycle engine laid out on a tarp. He held a wrench like he'd been born holding it, explaining with real confidence how the carburetor worked, pointing things out the way Roy had shown him weeks before. The boys watched him with wide, admiring eyes, the same way Danny used to watch the bikers. Inside, Sarah leaned against the counter for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and let herself look out at the crowded room. Tank stood near the window, head thrown back, laughing at something one of the older bikers had said, the sound rolling out warm and easy across the noise of the diner. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something settle deep in her chest. Hope, maybe, or something close enough to it. Sarah pulled into the parking lot before the sun was even all the way up, her travel mug of coffee sitting cold in the cup holder because she'd been too excited to drink it. 2 days. Just 2 more days until the hearing, until Linda stood up in front of a judge with all that evidence, all those signatures, all those letters from scared, angry people who had finally found their voice. She almost didn't see the paper taped to the glass door until she was standing right in front of it. It was official looking. A court seal in the corner. Her name typed out cold and formal at the top. Sarah's stomach dropped before her eyes even finished the first line. She read it twice, then a third time, because the words didn't make sense the first 2 times. Wendell Cross had filed a countersuit. He was claiming, in writing, backed by a lawyer with a fancy letterhead, that her husband had willingly signed the loan agreement, that there was nothing forced or forged about it, that Sarah owed every single penny, plus interest, plus now legal fees for dragging his good name through the mud. "That's a lie," she whispered to the empty parking lot. "That's a lie, and he knows it." She fumbled for her phone with shaking hands and called the bank, hoping maybe there was still time to move what little money she had before anything worse happened. The line clicked over to a hold recording. When a person finally answered, her voice was flat and apologetic in the way people get when they're about to deliver bad news they didn't cause. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller. Your accounts were frozen yesterday afternoon. Court order." "That's not possible," Sarah said. "The judge hasn't even heard the case yet." "I only see what's in the system," the woman said. "There's a lien attached, ma'am. I'd recommend speaking with your attorney." Sarah's hand dropped to her side, phone still connected, the woman's voice tinny and small and far away. She stood there in the cold morning air, staring at the diner that had just started to feel alive again, and felt the ground tilt underneath her. Someone had helped Cross move fast. Someone with a badge or a robe who owed him a favor. It didn't matter who. It only mattered that 2 days from a hearing that was supposed to save her, everything Sarah had left was locked up tight, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about it before Monday. She didn't call Tank. She told herself she would, later, once she figured out what to say. But the day moved fast and cruel after that. By evening, the real gut punch arrived through the television bolted up in the corner of the diner. the one that usually played nothing but weather and ball games while customers ate. Sarah was refilling napkin dispensers when one of the regulars, an older man named Frank, who came in every Tuesday for meatloaf, cleared his throat and nodded toward the screen. The local news anchor's voice filled the diner, smooth and serious. Behind her was a photo, grainy and taken from far away, of a line of motorcycles parked outside Sarah's building. Questions swirling tonight about a motorcycle gang's involvement in a local business dispute, with some residents calling it intimidation of a grieving widow. Sarah's hands went still. The segment cut to an interview with a woman Sarah didn't recognize, someone from 3 streets over who'd apparently called the station herself, wringing her hands about concerned citizens and not knowing what those men might be capable of. There was no mention of the roof they'd fixed, the food Sarah had cooked for free that snowy night, the forged documents Linda had spent weeks proving, just leather jackets and shadowy footage, and a narrator's voice dripping with suspicion. By the next morning, 3 regular customers canceled their standing breakfast orders. A birthday party of 12 called to say they'd decided to go somewhere else. The bell over the door, which had been ringing non-stop for 2 weeks, went quiet for long stretches at a time. That night, after closing, Sarah sat in the last booth with her face in her hands. Tank came in through the back, saw her shoulders shaking, and slid into the seat across from her without a word. "They're scared of you," she said finally, voice cracking. "Because of me. Because of my mess." "Sarah?" "Maybe it's best," she said, tears falling freely now. "If your club just stays away from here, from now on." The morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of light that made everything look tired. Sarah stood at the diner's front door with the key in her hand for a long moment before she turned it. Not to open, to lock. The sign in the window used to say "Open" in cheerful red letters that Danny had picked out at the hardware store. Sarah flipped it around so the word "Closed" faced the parking lot instead. She stared at it for a second, then pulled the blinds down too, like she didn't want anyone looking in, not even the empty lot. Inside, the diner felt strange. Too still. The chairs were still up on the tables from closing the night before, their legs pointing up at the ceiling like something dead. The griddle was cold. No coffee smell. No bacon. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the old clock above the register, counting seconds nobody needed counted. Sarah sat down in the last booth, the same one where she'd told Tank to stay away. She folded her hands on the table and looked at nothing. She didn't cry. She was past crying, it felt like. She just sat there, feeling the weight of the building settle down around her, feeling how quiet a place could get when it lost its people. She didn't hear Danny come down the stairs from the little apartment above the diner. She didn't hear him cross the kitchen either, soft in his socked feet. But she felt it when he stopped in the doorway that led into the dining room, felt his eyes on her before she even turned her head. "Mom?" Sarah looked up. Danny stood there in his pajama pants and an old hoodie, his hair sticking up on one side from sleep. He looked younger than 14 right then. He looked like he used to look before his father died, back when a nightmare was the worst thing that could wake him up in the middle of the night. "Why's it dark in here?" he asked. "Why's the sign turned around?" "We're closed today, baby." Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "Just today." Danny's eyes moved around the room, taking in the chairs stacked on tables, the cold griddle, all of it. Then his eyes landed on the window, like he was looking for something out there in the parking lot, looking for motorcycles that weren't coming. "Where's Roy?" he asked. "He said he was going to show me how to fix the carburetor today, he promised." Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. How did you explain something like this to a 14-year-old? How did you explain that fear made people do things they didn't want to do? That sometimes protecting the people you loved meant pushing away the very people who'd been helping you protect them? Things are just complicated right now, she said instead. The club, they're not coming around for a while. Why not? It's for the best, Danny. His face did something Sarah hadn't seen in a long time, not since right after his father's funeral. His jaw tightened. His eyes went glassy and hard at the same time. You told them to stay away, he said. It wasn't a question. Danny. You did. His voice cracked, somewhere between anger and hurt. Why would you do that? They didn't do anything wrong. I know that, Sarah said, standing up, reaching for him. I know, baby, it's not about that. But Danny had already turned and gone back up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and fast, the kind of footsteps that meant a door was about to close somewhere above her head. A second later, she heard it. The soft click of his bedroom door. Sarah stood alone in the dining room again, the silence pressing in even heavier than before. That evening, after Danny had gone to bed without dinner, without a word, Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at the screen. Tank's name. She let it ring twice before she picked up. Hey, Tank said, his voice low and careful, like he was walking on ice he wasn't sure would hold. I heard you closed up today. I did. Sarah, whatever's going on, we can figure it out. The lien, the lawsuit, the news thing, none of that has to mean the end of anything. Linda's still got 2 days to build the case stronger. We're not going anywhere unless you want us gone. Sarah closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Part of her wanted to say yes. Come back, please, I need you. But the bigger, older part of her, the part that had already lost a husband and nearly lost a diner and now might lose whatever was left, that part was too scared to hope any harder than she already had. I just need some space, Tank, she said quietly. Please, just for a little while. There was a long pause on the other end. Okay, he said finally, gentle as ever. Okay, Sarah. She hung up first. The kitchen was dark around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely, entirely alone. The Hells Angels clubhouse sat at the edge of town, a squat brick building with motorcycles lined up out front like soldiers standing guard. Inside, the main room smelled like coffee and engine oil, the walls covered in old photos, road maps, and a faded banner that read Brotherhood in peeling gold letters. Tank stood at the head of a long table, his arms crossed, his jaw set tight. Around him sat maybe 20 of his club members, the ones who'd been closest to this whole thing from the start. Roy was there too, sitting near the back, quiet, and looking more serious than Danny had ever seen him. Linda Carver sat at the far end of the table with a thick stack of folders in front of her, her reading glasses pushed up on her head. Next to her sat 3 other people Tank recognized from around town. Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the little bakery on 5th Street. Old Pete Grunwald, who'd owned the hardware store for 30 years. And a younger man named Curtis Boone, who'd lost his auto shop to Wendell Cross 2 years back and still hadn't found steady work since. Thank you all for coming, Tank said, his voice low but carrying easy through the room. I know some of you didn't figure a bunch of bikers would be the ones asking you to fight back, but we've all got the same enemy here, and I think it's time we stopped being afraid of him. Mrs. Alvarez folded her hands on the table. Cross took my building right out from under me, she said. Told me the papers said one thing, and when I finally got a lawyer to look, they said something else entirely. I didn't have the money to fight him. None of us did, Pete added. That's what he counts on. He picks people who can't afford to push back. Linda opened one of her folders and slid it toward the middle of the table. That's exactly what we're going to prove, she said. I've been going through everything the last few days. Bank records, loan documents, signatures. Cross has been running this same scheme for at least 6 years. Different names, different backgrounds, but always the same target. Small business owners, people without lawyers on retainer, people who trusted him. Tank looked around the table at all the faces that had been quietly carrying this weight for years, thinking they were alone in it. Sarah's case is just the one that finally brought it into the light, Tank said. But it's bigger than her. It's bigger than the diner. This is about every person in this room who got taken advantage of and thought there was nothing they could do about it. Curtis leaned forward, his hands rough and scarred from years of shop work. So what do we do? Tank looked at Linda. She nodded, and he continued. There's a hearing in 3 days, Tank said. Cross is going to try to use it to bury Sarah and this whole thing under paperwork and lies. Linda's got the evidence. But evidence alone doesn't always win in a room like that. Sometimes a judge needs to see the people standing behind it. You mean show up, Pete said. I mean show up right, Tank said. Not loud, not angry, just there. Every one of us who's got a story, every one of us who's got proof, standing together so nobody in that courthouse can pretend this is just one woman's bad luck. Roy spoke up from the back of the room. Sarah told us to stay away. Tank's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. She did. And I understand why. She's scared, and she's got every right to be, after everything she's lost. He paused, looking around at the club, at Linda, at the small business owners who'd trusted him enough to walk through that door. But walking away isn't in my nature. Not when I know something's right. We're not going to push our way back into her life. We're going to do this the right way, quiet and steady, and let the truth speak for itself. If she still wants us gone after that, fine. But I'm not going to let Wendell Cross win because good people got too scared to stand together. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Alvarez nodded, slow and certain. I'll be there, she said. Me too, said Pete. Curtis looked at his hands, then up at Tank. Yeah, he said. Count me in. Linda closed her folder and looked around the table. Then let's get to work, she said. We've got 3 days. The diner was dark, except for the small light above the stove, the one Sarah always left on out of habit, even when there was nothing left to cook. Danny stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, his bare feet cold against the wood floor, and watched his mother sit alone at the little table where they usually ate breakfast together. She didn't hear him. She had her hands pressed against her face, and her shoulders were shaking in that quiet way that meant she was trying hard not to make any noise. There was a stack of papers in front of her. Danny recognized them. Bills. The lien letter. Copies of everything Linda had given her to look over before the hearing. He almost turned around and went back to bed. That was what he usually did. He'd learned a long time ago that when his mom cried, the kindest thing he could do was pretend he hadn't seen it, so she wouldn't have to feel embarrassed on top of everything else. But tonight, something in his chest wouldn't let him walk away. Mom? Sarah's head snapped up. She wiped her face fast with the back of her hand, the way she always did, like she could erase it if she was quick enough. Danny, hey, I didn't hear you get up. Are you okay? I'm fine, honey. She tried to smile. It didn't work very well. Just tired. Big day tomorrow. Danny walked into the kitchen and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers, at the word lion stamped across the top of one of them in red letters, and something inside him hardened, like a decision he didn't know he'd already made. I want to talk at the hearing tomorrow, he said. Sarah blinked at him. What? I want to tell the judge about the post, the one I wrote, about why I did it. For a second, Sarah just stared at him, like she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. Then her eyes filled up again, but it was different this time. Not just sadness, something softer. Danny, you don't have to do that. This isn't your fight. You're 14. It is my fight, Danny said, and his voice cracked a little, but he kept going anyway. I made it my fight when I wrote that post. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to be mad, or embarrassed, or think I didn't trust you to handle it. But I was scared, Mom. I saw you crying over the bills that night, same as you're crying now, and I didn't know how to help you. So I typed some words into a computer because it was the only thing I could do. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. And it worked, Danny said. It brought Tank here. It brought all of this here. The good stuff and the hard stuff. And now Wendell Cross is trying to make it look like none of that matters, like it was just bikers causing trouble. I want the judge to know the truth. I want him to know why they came. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the withdrawn boy who'd barely spoken for 2 years, but someone brave, someone who had been carrying more than she'd ever realized. Okay, she finally said, her voice thick. Okay, Danny, if you want to do this, I'll be right there next to you. Danny let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Really? Really? She squeezed his hand. I'm scared for you. I won't lie about that. But I am so proud of you right now. I don't even have words for it. They stayed up late after that, sitting together at the kitchen table with a pad of paper between them. Sarah helped Danny find the words, crossing out sentences that sounded too grown up, too rehearsed, and telling him to just say what was true. Start with why, she told him. Just tell them why. Danny wrote it down slowly, chewing on the end of the pencil the way he used to when he was little. Somewhere around midnight, Sarah made 2 cups of hot chocolate, and they sat there together under the kitchen light, closer than they had been in a very long time. The morning of the hearing came in gray and cold, with a thin sky that looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain. Sarah barely slept. She lay awake most of the night going over Danny's words in her head. And when the alarm went off at 6, she was already sitting up in bed, staring at the ceiling. Danny was quiet on the drive into town. But it wasn't the old kind of quiet, the kind that used to worry her. He held a folded piece of paper in his lap, the speech they'd written together, and every few minutes his lips moved slightly as he read it over to himself. You don't have to memorize it, Sarah said, glancing at him at a red light. Just read it. Nobody expects you to be perfect. I know, Danny said. I just want to get it right. When they turned onto Main Street, Sarah's stomach dropped, but not from fear. Ahead, in front of the old brick courthouse with its tall white columns, was a crowd unlike anything Miller's Crossing had seen in years. Motorcycles lined the street in neat rows, chrome catching what little sunlight pushed through the clouds. And standing beside them, in leather vests and quiet rows, were the Hells Angels. All 68 of them. They weren't shouting. They weren't causing a scene. They stood shoulder to shoulder along the courthouse steps, arms crossed, faces solemn like a wall of quiet strength. Some of the other business owners from town were there too, people Sarah recognized from the diner over the years. The hardware store owner, the woman who ran the flower shop, all of them victims of Wendell Cross in one way or another. Linda stood near the top of the steps in a sharp gray suit, a leather folder tucked under one arm, watching for Sarah's car. Sarah parked, and for a moment she just sat there, hands on the wheel, taking it all in. Mom, Danny said softly, look. Tank stood near the front of the group, right at the bottom of the steps, exactly where he could see the parking lot. When he spotted Sarah's car, something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, like he'd been holding his breath the same way she had. Sarah and Danny got out of the car. The whole street seemed to still. Then Tank started walking toward them, and one by one, the bikers behind him did too, until Sarah and Danny were surrounded by a small crowd of leather and quiet nods. "You didn't have to do this," Sarah said, her voice catching. "Yeah, we did," Tank said. He looked down at Danny, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. "You ready, kid?" Danny swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." Linda came down the steps to meet them, her expression calm but focused, the look of someone who had done this 100 times but still cared about every single one. "We've got everything we need," she told Sarah quietly. "Bank records, forged signatures, testimony from 3 other victims. This is going to work, Sarah, I promise you." Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling. Danny reached over and took one of them, holding it steady. They walked up the courthouse steps together, Sarah and Danny in the middle, Linda ahead of them, and Tank and the club falling in around them like a slow-moving wall of protection. People on the street stopped to watch. Someone took a picture. Sarah didn't care anymore what the news might say about it. Let them look. Let them see exactly who had shown up for her family. Inside, the courtroom was already filling with people. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of the crowd, and low voices murmured back and forth until a bailiff called for order. Sarah and Danny took their seats in the front row of the gallery, Linda moving to the table at the front where a thick folder of documents sat waiting. Across the aisle, Wendell Cross sat beside his lawyer, his suit crisp, his face arranged into a mask of calm confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. The judge entered, and everyone rose. When they sat back down, the room grew still, all shuffling and whispering fading into silence. "We are here today," the judge said, looking over his glasses at the courtroom, "to review the case regarding the emergency lien placed on the Miller's Crossing diner and allegations of fraud against Mr. Wendell Cross." Linda stood, straightening the folder in front of her. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I would like to begin by presenting the financial records and forged documents central to this case." Sarah's hand found Danny's under the table, and she held on tight. Linda spoke for almost 20 minutes, laying out bank statements and forged signatures on a big screen at the front of the courtroom. She showed the judge how Wendell Cross had changed numbers on old paperwork, how 3 other business owners had been tricked the same way Sarah's husband had been years before. Wendell's lawyer objected a few times, but the judge just nodded and told Linda to keep going. Sarah watched the judge's face carefully, trying to read it, but he gave nothing away. Then Linda turned and looked toward the front row. "Your Honor, I would like to call one more witness, Danny Miller." A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah felt Danny's hand tense in hers before he let go and stood up. He smoothed down his shirt, the same way he used to do before school presentations, and walked to the front of the room. His legs looked a little shaky, but his chin was up. The bailiff swore him in, and Danny sat down in the witness chair, his folded paper trembling slightly in his hands. He looked so young sitting there, smaller somehow against the tall wood paneling behind him. Sarah's chest ached watching him, wishing she could carry this weight for him. But this was his to carry. He had chosen it. "Take your time, son," the judge said, his voice gentler than before. Danny unfolded his paper, glanced at it, then folded it back up and set it on his knee. He looked out at the courtroom instead, right past his mother, right past Tank, and the rows of leather vests standing quietly along the back wall. "My dad died 2 years ago," Danny said. His voice cracked on the word, Dad, but he kept going. "After that, it was just me and my mom. She runs our diner all by herself. She works all day and all night, and she never complains, but I used to hear her crying sometimes, in the kitchen after she thought I was asleep." He stopped for a second, swallowing hard. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth. "One night I found the bills on the counter. I saw how much we owed. I didn't know what to do. I was scared we were going to lose everything, the diner, our house, all of it. So I did something kind of stupid. I found this forum online for a Hells Angels charity thing. I didn't even think anyone would read it. I just wrote about my mom and how hard she works and how I was scared for her. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anybody. I just hit send and figured nothing would happen." Danny looked down at his hands. "Then that night of the blizzard, all those bikers showed up at our diner. I didn't know it was because of what I wrote. Not until way later. But that night, watching my mom cook for all those strangers, watching her open the door when she could have just locked it and turned off the lights, I remembered why I loved her so much. She never turns away from somebody who needs help, even when she's scared, even when she's got nothing left to give." His voice grew steadier as he spoke, like something inside him was settling into place. "Wendell Cross tried to take that away from her, from us. He took advantage of my dad, and then he tried to take advantage of my mom too because he thought nobody would notice or care. But people did notice. People did care, and I just want the court to know that my mom didn't do anything wrong. She's the strongest person I know. All she ever wanted was to keep our home and take care of me. That's it. That's all this was ever about." Danny stopped, his chest rising and falling fast, and set his paper down completely, not needing it anymore. The courtroom was silent. Completely silent. Even the shuffling papers and quiet coughs that had filled the room all morning seemed to disappear. The judge sat very still, his glasses pushed up on his nose, his eyes unmistakably shining. Danny stood, walked back to his seat, and sat down beside his mother. Sarah reached for him immediately, pulling him close, tears sliding down her cheeks as she pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Around the courtroom, she could hear soft sniffling, the creak of someone shifting in their seat, the quiet clearing of a throat. Something in the room had shifted. Sarah could feel it. The judge called a 15-minute recess, and when she came back, she brought 2 other people with her, sitting quietly in the front row where Sarah hadn't noticed them before. An older man in a flannel shirt, twisting a cap in his hands. A woman about Sarah's age, holding a folder against her chest like a shield. "Your Honor," Linda said, "I'd like to call our next witnesses. Mr. Harold Pruitt, owner of Pruitt's Hardware, and Mrs. Denise Alvarez, owner of Alvarez Family Bakery." One by one they took the stand. Harold's voice shook as he talked about a loan he never signed, a signature that wasn't his but looked close enough to fool a bank teller. Denise cried when she described losing her father's bakery building for 2 years before a lawyer friend helped her get it back, only to have Cross come after her again with a new set of papers. Wendell Cross sat at his table, his face gray, his lawyer whispering things in his ear that didn't seem to help. Sarah watched him shrink smaller and smaller in his chair as each witness spoke. The confident, smiling man who had once stood in her diner talking about payment plans looked like nothing more than a scared, cornered animal. Now, when the cross-examination came, Linda didn't even need to raise her voice. She simply laid the forged signatures side by side on the big screen, real ones next to fake ones, and let the jury of one, the judge, see the truth with her own eyes. The pen strokes didn't match. The dates didn't line up. Bank records showed deposits that had nothing to do with any real loan. Wendell's lawyer tried one more objection, but the judge held up her hand. "I've seen enough," she said. The courtroom went still again, that same held breath feeling from when Danny had spoken. Sarah reached for Tank's hand without thinking, and he took it, his rough fingers wrapping around hers like he'd been waiting for her to reach out. The judge folded her hands on the desk in front of her and looked out over the courtroom, her eyes moving from Sarah to Danny to Harold and Denise to Wendell Cross himself. "In all my years on this bench," she said, "I don't see cases like this often. Cases where the evidence is this clear and where the harm done is this deep. Mr. Cross, you preyed on people who trusted you. Widows, small business owners, people who had nowhere else to turn. You forged their signatures and inflated their debts, and you nearly cost this family their home and their livelihood." She turned a page in front of her. "I am voiding the debt against Sarah Miller in full. The lien against Miller's Crossing Diner is dissolved, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering Mr. Cross's assets frozen pending the outcome of criminal charges, which I expect the district attorney's office will be pursuing swiftly, given what we've seen here today." She brought her gavel down once, sharp and final. "This court is adjourned." The room exploded into sound. Sarah didn't even remember standing up, but suddenly she was on her feet, and Danny was hugging her so tight she could barely breathe, and behind her she heard someone whoop, a deep, rough voice that could only belong to one of the bikers. Outside on the courthouse steps, the cold air hit Sarah's face. But she didn't feel it. Not really. Because the moment she stepped through the big doors, she was swallowed up in a wall of leather and arms and voices, Tank's whole club crowding around her, slapping her on the back, hugging her so hard her feet nearly left the ground. Roy picked Danny up like he weighed nothing and spun him once before setting him back down, laughing. Harold and Denise were there too, crying and laughing at the same time, hugging strangers like old friends. Someone had brought a thermos of hot chocolate, and it got passed around the crowd, cup after cup, steam rising into the cold morning air. Sarah was laughing, tears streaming down her face, when she felt a hand on her elbow, gently pulling her a step away from the crowd. She turned and found Tank standing there, his eyes soft, something folded carefully in his jacket pocket. "Sarah," he said, his voice quiet under all the noise around them. "I've got one more thing I want to give you." A few days later, the diner buzzed with its old life again. The bank had unfrozen every account. The line was gone like it had never been there at all. Sarah stood behind the counter that morning, watching regulars fill the booths, hearing the clink of forks on plates, and she let herself believe, really believe, that it was all going to be okay. Around noon, Tank walked in wearing a clean flannel shirt instead of his usual leather cut. He looked almost nervous, which was strange for a man his size, a man who had faced down lawyers and judges without blinking. "Got a minute?" he asked. "You and Danny both. There's something I want to show you." Sarah untied her apron and called Danny in from the back, where he'd been helping Roy fix a busted freezer hinge. The three of them walked out the back door of the diner, past the dumpster, past the old fence line that marked the edge of the property. Snow crunched under their boots. The afternoon sun was bright but weak, the kind of winter light that promised spring was still a long way off, but coming anyway. Tank led them to a patch of land just past the fence, maybe the size of 2 parking spots, choked with dead weeds and old brush. It didn't look like much, just a forgotten corner nobody had touched in years. "This was my mother's garden," Tank said, stopping at the edge of it. "Way back, before the land got sold off in pieces. She grew tomatoes here, beans, a whole row of sunflowers along that back edge, so tall they used to scare me when I was little." He almost smiled at the memory. She used to say a garden was proof that good things could grow even when everything else was hard. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, the same one Sarah had noticed tucked away days before, back on the courthouse steps. He'd said he had one more thing to give her, but then the chaos of the crowd had swept them apart before he could explain. Now he opened it and held it out to her. "It's yours," he said. "This little piece here. I had the lawyer draw it up last week. Soon as the dust settled with Cross, I wanted it done right." Sarah took the papers with shaking hands. Legal language swam in front of her eyes, but she caught the important parts. A transfer of deed. Her name, Danny's name too, listed right underneath hers. "Tank," she whispered. "I can't take this. This was your mother's." "That's exactly why I want you to have it," he said, his voice steady even though his eyes looked wet in the cold air. "My mother lost this place a long time ago, and it about broke her heart. I always figured I'd just find it someday, look at it, maybe make peace with it. I didn't know I'd find you and Danny here too. Feels like she led me right to where I needed to be." He shrugged, a big man trying to make himself smaller. "Seems fitting her garden should go to people who know how to make something out of nothing. You've been doing that every day since I met you." Sarah looked down at the papers, then out at the tangled, frozen ground, trying to picture it the way Tank must have as a boy. Tomatoes, beans, sunflowers taller than a child's head. She thought about her own mother, gone many years now, and about Danny's father, and about all the pieces of family that got lost and somehow found their way back together in strange, roundabout ways. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Tank, burying her face against his shoulder, feeling the papers crinkle between them. He held her back carefully, like she was something precious, his big hand resting flat against her back. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice muffled and thick with tears. Behind them, Danny had already crouched down at the edge of the frozen dirt, pushing aside a layer of snow with his bare hand. "We could do tomatoes," he said, more to himself than anyone else, "and maybe corn, if there's enough room. Roy said his uncle grows pumpkins. We could ask him what seeds are easy for beginners." He looked up, eyes bright with a kind of excitement Sarah hadn't seen in him for 2 long years. "Mom, can we get seed catalogs, like, this week?" Snow had come and gone twice already since that first blizzard, and now the diner looked nothing like it used to. The old cracked sign was gone, replaced by a new one, hand-painted by a club member who used to do pinstriping on motorcycle tanks. It read, "Miller's Angels Diner," in bold red letters, with a little painted snowflake tucked into the corner of the M underneath. In smaller letters, someone had added, "Est during the storm." Inside, the walls told the whole story. Sarah had framed dozens of photos from that first night, blown up big and hung in neat rows along the wall by the register. There was one of 68 bikers crammed into booths meant for 20 people, blankets pulled up to their chins, looking like giants trying to fit into a dollhouse. There was one of Tank asleep sitting straight up, arms crossed, like even in sleep he was standing guard. There was one of Danny, caught mid-laugh, sandwiched between 2 huge men in leather vests, looking smaller and happier than he had in years. The diner was packed that afternoon. Regulars filled the booths, trading gossip over coffee. A cluster of bikers sat at the counter. The same men who had once slept on this floor, now regulars who showed up every Tuesday for meatloaf special. Kids from town came in after school, drawn by rumors of free pie for good grades, a tradition Sarah had started without really meaning to, and now couldn't stop. Roy stood near the door, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, laughing at something Danny had said. Danny had grown taller over the months, filled out some, his voice not so quiet anymore. He worked the diner most afternoons after school, taking orders, learning to flip pancakes, but his real joy was still out back with Roy and the bikes. Sarah moved through the diner with the easy rhythm of someone who had found her footing again. She refilled coffee cups, laughed at old jokes, checked on the register. The bell over the door jingled constantly, a sound she used to dread when business was slow and now loved because it meant the diner was alive. Near closing time, the sky outside turned that heavy gray color that meant snow was coming. Sarah noticed it through the window while wiping down the counter, and something in her chest went still. Not with fear this time, but with a kind of quiet anticipation. She walked to the front window and looked out at the parking lot. The first flakes had started falling, small and soft, dusting the tops of the motorcycles parked in a neat row along the edge of the lot. Roy and Danny were out there, along with 2 other bikers, tossing a football back and forth in the cold, their breath coming out in white clouds. Danny caught the ball and spiked it into a snowbank, laughing so hard he doubled over, and Roy tackled him gently into the same snowbank just for good measure. The other men hollered and laughed, snow flying everywhere. Sarah smiled, watching her son laugh like that, so free and easy, nothing like the quiet, closed-off boy he'd been just a year ago. "Here," Tank's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling up from both. He handed her one, careful the way he always was, like he still couldn't quite believe he got to do small things like this for her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. They stood together at the window, shoulder to shoulder, watching the snow fall harder now, watching Danny wrestle Roy for the football, watching the flakes settle on the parking lot and the motorcycles, and the new sign that bore her name and Tank's mother's memory all at once. "First snow of the season," Tank said quietly. "I know," Sarah said. She took a sip of coffee, felt the warmth spread through her chest, and realized she wasn't holding her breath the way she used to whenever winter came around. She wasn't bracing for something bad. She was just watching it snow. "Used to hate this time of year," she admitted. "Every storm felt like something else I had to survive." Tank looked down at her, his eyes soft in the gray afternoon light. "And now?" Sarah watched Danny throw his head back, laughing, watched the snow catch in his hair, watched the whole parking lot fill up with white. "Now I know," she said. "Some of the coldest nights bring the warmest miracles." I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.